Let's move now to the USA, and there have been days of protests in the wake of the police killing of George Floyd. In Washington, the army's been deployed. Curfews have been imposed in several cities. Let's get the very latest now with our correspondent Simon Marks in Washington. Good evening to you, Simon. Just first update us on how Tuesday night went.
Well, Tuesday night was more tranquil than the previous nights, Sally, offering perhaps a hope that some of the looting and worst scenes of violence are now behind America. But there are more protests taking shape even as we speak that will be rolled out across the country tonight. Washington, D.C. will spend a third night under curfew. And there are very worrying signs of heavily armed military figures wearing combat fatigues on the streets of Washington, D.C., particularly at the moment. Many of them displaying no insignia, no identification, and when you ask them which government department they're from, they either refuse to answer the question, or in some cases they say they're from the Department of Justice, which is very odd, because the Department of Justice has no military force on which to call. So this city certainly still feels like a fortress. There was some tear gas fired in Atlanta overnight, some looting there, other pockets of trouble in different parts of the country, but a better night, and a night in which the protesters absolutely are focusing on demonstrating peacefully and encouraging one another not to engage in any acts of violence or looting.
You know, Simon, there's been much debate around Donald Trump's next move, and that he's apparently considering the 1807 Insurrection Act. Now, if he invokes that, my understanding is that he can go over the governor's heads and he could actually coast to coast just deploy active duty soldiers. Do you think that's likely? I mean, he's been criticized for even considering that by even the defense secretary.
If Donald Trump wants to put military forces, American army forces, on the streets of American cities, he's got to invoke the Insurrection Act, because there's no other way of him sending soldiers to American cities. The army exists to fight wars overseas, not here at home. But now Donald Trump is facing a massive challenge to his own authority. As you said, the Defense Secretary Mark Esper, within the last couple of hours, has held a very dramatic press conference at the Pentagon in which he has said he absolutely opposes the use of the Insurrection Act, absolutely opposes the idea that US troops should be deployed to combat political protests. Within the last 5 minutes, we have heard reports from the Associated Press that defense officials, that's officials from the Pentagon, are ordering active duty troops brought here to Washington, D.C. to return to their home bases. Mark Esper has headed to the White House for what we believe is going to be a showdown meeting with the President of the United States. But there is every indication here this afternoon that neither the Defense Secretary nor the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, are willing to implement orders that President Trump may be either about to give them or maybe already did give them. And the Defense Secretary also indicated he was very uncomfortable about being dragooned to participate in that photo op at a church near the White House just a matter of minutes after Donald Trump authorized the use of chemical gas against demonstrators who were engaged in their constitutionally protected right peacefully to protest on the streets outside the White House.
So, showdown, it seems, politically for Trump on the way. What is going to happen on the streets with the protesters? As you say, it was a quieter night. Where is this issue, do you think, going to go politically for Trump, and then in terms of the protests and what they want to achieve?
Well, one thing's absolutely for certain, Sally. There is no end in sight to these protests. We're expecting more major developments this afternoon. The Attorney General in Minnesota is preparing to file additional charges against some of the officers involved in George Floyd's killing. Barack Obama, the former President of the United States, will be addressing the nation in about 3.5 hours' time here. That's going to be a very big moment. The protesters will be taking their cues in large measure from him. And Donald Trump has done nothing to damp down the fury of protesters and demonstrators angry not just over the killing of George Floyd, but a situation in which the country has 40 million people unemployed, a coronavirus pandemic that has taken over 105,000 lives, and a president of the United States they perceive to be acting in an authoritarian way that is in contravention of America's tradition and its constitution.
Well, while things seem to be coming to a head at home in the US, Trump, it still seems, has plans to ban Chinese airlines from its airports from the 16th of June. Tell us more about that.
Yeah. This is a very big move in Donald Trump's sanctions battle with the Chinese over China's decision to impose a new security law in Hong Kong. Ironically, of course, the White House accuses China of preparing to suppress protests and demonstrations in Hong Kong at exactly the time that President Trump is accused of trying to suppress protests and demonstrations in the United States. No Chinese airline will be allowed to fly into the United States from June the 16th onwards. Air China certainly has had a large footprint here. I've made the Air China flight from Washington to Beijing several times myself over the last couple of years. Those flights come to an end. That's going to have a huge impact for Chinese professionals, diplomats, business people, students trying to come to the United States. There will be a tit-for-tat response from China. It's going to make travel between these two enormous and enormously important countries very difficult for weeks, if not months, to come. And it adds up to an increasingly chilly relationship between Washington and Beijing.
Well, thank you very much. That is our correspondent in Washington, Simon Marks, coming to us live there this evening.